I read something one time, and it stated that in the South, he was looked at as a hero. And when you have any time of crisis, your people always looking for someone that they could look up to. The feats that Semmes did on the high seas, he captured the imagination of people in England, France, everywhere. And people were constantly writing about him. But now, if you were from up north, you hated him. And just like anybody, you're going to label him, if you hate him, the lowest names that you can think of, which they did. Raphael Semmes was an individual who moved to this part of the United States when his service in the Navy started winding down in between wars. After the war with Mexico, he came to this area, and he was still in the Navy, but he taught himself to be a lawyer. And in the year 1861, when the hostilities appeared to be evident between the North and South, Raphael Semmes resigned his commission with the United States Navy, and he traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, and offered his services to Jefferson Davis to be part of the Confederate Navy, which did not exist. Jefferson Davis gave him a couple of odd chores. One was to actually travel to New York by train. And once he was up in New York by train, he was given orders to buy munitions and armaments for the South, which he did do. And he traveled back to this part of the country with the arms and armament. When he got back to Montgomery, he started lobbying Jefferson Davis and his cabinet to take an approach to deal with the United States that if they do produce a blockade, he had an idea of a way to break that blockade. And he said that if they use commerce raiders, the commerce raiders would disrupt the United States merchant marine activity. It would cause insurance rates to increase, especially from Lloyd's of London. If the insurance rates start going up, then he was thinking that the merchants in the Northeast would start pressuring the United States government to end any type of hostilities that may develop between the United States and the South. Well, the other part of his plan too was to weaken the blockade so supplies could get into the southern ports. His thoughts were that if he had a commerce raider, or if there were a fleet of commerce raiders, a poor man's fleet if you will, then the United States would be forced to withdraw or pull back ships that they had blockading ports. After he convinced Jefferson Davis and his staff to allow him to develop this commerce raiding idea, he traveled to New Orleans looking for any type of ship that could be easily converted. And he found an old mailer that used to go back and forth from the southern states to Cuba, and he converted that ship. Well, at this particular time period, New Orleans was blockaded. So Semmes waited and bided his time, and when the right moment occurred, heavy fog and so forth, he slipped out right past the blockade and started doing his raiding. And within a couple of weeks, he had already stopped and destroyed 16 ships that were licensed to the United States government. He went on with that ship for a few more months until it started, like any boat, getting a little afoul from weather and everything else. And he eventually was trapped, if you will, at Gibraltar by a couple of Union warships that were trying to catch him. Well, in Gibraltar, he couldn't fight the Union warships, so what he decided to do was just simply sell the Sumter, and he and his officers started proceeding back to the South. Well, en route to the South, he was notified that a new ship had been built. And when Semmes arrived, that's when all the armaments were put on board the Alabama. And then Semmes did something that helped a group of us in Mobile prove that the Alabama wasn't a pirate ship nor a privateer. He commissioned the Alabama a warship in the Confederate States of America. And we have copies of that document. They're in Washington, D.C. When we proved to the United States government that it was not a privateer or warship, the State Department agreed to help us in acquiring the title to the ship for the United States. And that's what we did. Semmes took the Alabama from there and went on a 2-year cruise. He boarded over 400 ships. He stopped them at sea, and he was checking their papers. And what he was trying to find out, if the ship was neutral, if the cargo was neutral. If so, he just allowed it pass. But if the ship was registered to the United States, or if the cargo could be considered contraband for the United States, he would take the cargo and he would destroy the ship or burn the cargo in the ship. But one of the things he did, he made sure that no one was ever harmed. No one. After 2 years of being on the high seas and just putting into ports that are fairly favorable to the south, the Alabama's going to need some major repair. And what Semmes tried not to do was to get blockaded into a port like he did with the Sumter. But his options were very limited. If he went back to England, his ship would be taken over by the English government. So he went to France, and he went to France because France still had some signs that they were favorable to the south. But the leader of France at the time period when the Alabama pulled into port wanted nothing to do with this because it was 1864. In 1864, Gettysburg had already taken place. If you will, the Mississippi River was already conquered. Things were not good for the South, and he didn't need this political problem at his doorstep. And when Semmes pulled into port, the American consul there sent out a message: any ship, U.S. warship in the vicinity, come down to Cherbourg, blockade the Alabama. Well, Winslow happened to be up in the area what we now call the Netherlands, and he steamed down towards Cherbourg. He pulled into the harbor, which was against the laws of the time period. You couldn't have two belligerent ships in the same harbor. And since the Alabama was there first, the only thing Winslow could do, he had to leave, or the French Navy would destroy his ship. So Semmes challenged, sent a letter to Winslow, and basically paraphrasing it, said, "Sir, if you kindly wait until Sunday, the 19th, I will gladly come out and engage you." Word spread all over Europe. People were coming from Paris by train. People were coming from England by yachts. People wanted to see this thing. Semmes pulls out of the dock area, and after about an hour's time, the Alabama is sinking. Alabama was no match for the Kearsarge's guns. As I grew older and learned more about the man, through teaching, I started thinking, wouldn't it be interesting, wouldn't it be fascinating if we could really find the ship and recover items from that ship that deal with the man? In this room, there's a ship's bell, and some people say the bell is the heart of the ship. We have the heart, but the heartbeat of the ship was Raphael Semmes. Now behind me is a cannon that came off the Alabama. When we recovered this cannon, it's stayed in this solution for some time. Well, one of the real good friends of mine at the lab contacted me, and he said, we have a problem. He said, as we were removing some of this incrustation around the barrel, we discovered the remains of a crewman. We have to stop. So I traveled to Washington. I talked to the powers there, and we worked out an agreement that if, once they've gotten through studying the remains, trying to identify the remains which were sent to Hawaii, we in Mobile would like to do a proper burial for the remains here in Mobile. So about 5 years ago, we had an 1860s funeral for this crewman. When the war was over and Semmes came back to Mobile with his family, Semmes was elected as a judge here, but the United States government refused to allow him to take the position. He practiced the little law, but the United States tried to stop him from doing that as well. So he started teaching and lecturing. He taught a little bit at LSU, and then he came back and started teaching in this area and also speaking. And when he died, the people here mourned heavily for him. He's respected in this area. People who know history respect him a great deal.